Welcome to the Forum on the Humanities in the Public World, sponsored by the Townsend Center for the Humanities. My name is Tony Cascardi. I'm the Townsend Center Director. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. When we began the forum as a project a few years ago, it was our intention and our hope to bring the work of contemporary writers, artists, and intellectuals, and not only of academics, into the conversation about the humanities and at Berkeley, and at the same time to establish and help bring out into relief the particular importance of the humanities for conversations about such things as the public good, questions about values, and broadly conceived understandings of the basic mission of a great public research university such as Berkeley is. In the course of this time, we've had the privilege of hosting quite an array of individuals in the forum, ranging from performing artists such as Alfred Brendel and Anna Deavere Smith, to legal scholars such as Bruce Ackerman, and policymakers Robert Reich. But I would say that all along the way we had in mind something like an ideal type for the forum, the kind of person one would unhesitatingly recognize as a public intellectual, the kind of person whose range of interests and scope of work could truly speak to public issues from the perspective of the humanities. And although it took a while before we could actually bring him to Berkeley, there was never any doubt in our minds that Terry Eagleton was exactly such an individual. Many of you will know him as the foremost Marxist literary theorist of recent decades, and many of you likewise will have personal experiences and memories of the charged debates that were sparked by the publication of his challenging little book, Literary Theory and Introduction, little in size only, rest assured. Others will recognize that the ideology of the aesthetic was among a handful of works that helped drive humanities scholarship in its very significant recent aesthetic turn. But Terry Eagleton has truly an astounding range and number of publications. These are only some of the scantest highlights. Indeed, if there is a more prolific literary critic writing today, I don't want to know it. He told me over lunch about his books for 2011, 12, and 13. He has written, indeed, an astounding number of works, but not only of academic scholarship and theory. Among them, also a memoir entitled The Gatekeeper, a play, St. Oscar, about Oscar Wilde, and the script for what began as a television program and ended up as Derek Jarman's film Wittgenstein. He has taught widely at the universities of Manchester and Oxford, and now visits regularly at the University of Notre Dame. Most recently, his attention has turned toward questions of violence and religion and related subjects. He's published Holy Terror in 2005, The Trouble with Strangers, A Study of Ethics, 2008, Reason, Faith, and Revolution, Reflections on the God Debate, and just released from Yale University Press, Evil. I'd like to leave you, before turning the podium over to him, with a brief quotation from his After Theory of 2003. Cultural theory as we have it, he writes, promises to grapple with some fundamental problems, but on the whole fails to deliver. It has been shamefaced about morality and metaphysics, embarrassed about love, biology, religion, and revolution, largely silent about evil, reticent about death and suffering, dogmatic about essences, universals, and foundations, and superficial about truth, objectivity, and disinterestedness. This, on any estimate, is a rather large slice of human existence to fall down on. His talk this afternoon is entitled The Death of Criticism. Please join me in welcoming Terry Eagleton.
It was with great pleasure that I dedicated my book on evil to Henry Kissinger. Well, it's delightful to be back in Berkeley. The first time I clapped eyes on the place, I realized, was in 1970. Well, clapped eyes might be something of an exaggeration given the smoke and the tear gas. Maybe history is about to repeat itself, who knows. Literary critics like myself live in a sort of permanent state of dread really. I mean, a fear that one day some clerk in a government office idly turning over a leaf will stumble on the shameful truth that we're actually paid for reading poems, novels, and plays. I mean, struck by the fact that this is every bit as scandalous as being paid for, having sex or sunbathing, the clerk will throw himself on the phone to his superior and blow the whistle on the lot of us. Erstwhile experts in Jane Austen will be fixing computers and we'll all be rounded up and made to labour in the countryside. The open secret, of course, of literary studies being that it's far too pleasurable an activity to be a bona fide discipline. But the scandal cuts deeper than that, really. It's not only that we're paid for reading books, we're actually paid outrageously for reading books about people who never existed and events that never took place. In ordinary life, talking about people who never existed is known as psychosis. In universities, it's called literary criticism. Quantum physicists work on entities that may or may not exist. There seems to be some doubt about the matter, and the same, of course, applies to theologians. There are debates among sociologists as to whether, say, the Bank of England exists in the same sense that banknotes do, or whether it's just an assemblage of, chairs and filing cabinets and people and so on. The mathematicians of a Platonic turn of mind hold that, numbers are somehow actually out there, along with, Madonna and the Grand Canyon and various other phenomena, whereas, other mathematicians hold that numbers are no more out there than the concept of crimson is. Speaking of Madonna, by the way, as I frequently find myself doing, and I beg of you not to let this go beyond these four walls. I hope that's not a camera there at the back. I actually once slept in her bed. She wasn't there herself. She hadn't been there for a very long time. Incidentally, anybody who would like the background to that story, if you approach me privately later for a very modest fee, I will feel it. I mean, even maverick archaeologists in search of the lost island of Atlantis, or astrophysicists who surmise that there may be an infinity of universes, each, if we're unfortunate, equipped with its Dick Cheney. Even they may just be onto something, but we, alas, are onto nothing at all. There never was anybody called Emma Woodhouse or Emma Bovary, and a particularly bitter twist this, even if there were, it would make no difference to the kind of things that critics say about them, for literary theoretical reasons too tedious to go into here. Critics don't have the satisfaction of working on things that indubitably exist, like sick dogs or dental cavities. I suppose you might say cultural critics work on things that exist, called cultures, particularly these days minority cultures. My wife and two of my 5 children, who are American, my wife and 2 of my children are American, belong to that most bitterly persecuted minority of all in this country, those Americans who have not been abducted by aliens. I mean, it really is a terrible life. People turn their backs on them, they're shunned from various clubs, they can't get various welfare benefits, that are handed out. Aliens, of course, this is a diversion, as you may have noticed, but so is the whole paper. Aliens, you notice how extraordinarily humanoid aliens seem to be. That they're, they might be only 3 foot high and green and smell of sulfur and have no noses, but basically they look like Tony Blair, really, pretty much. Aliens are merely testimony to the paucity of the human imagination, aren't they? We can't get beyond ourselves, really. So literary critics are tempted then, I suppose, to make a virtue of necessity, to tough it out, and to argue that working on things that don't exist is even more valuable than working on things that do. And this is known, in a word, as the creative imagination. Yeah? And the creative imagination, of course, being one of those phrases that everybody on the planet seems to find unequivocally positive, like, have another Guinness, or let's shoot the Duke of Edinburgh, or something like that. Well, everybody apart from me, I think, I'm afraid, I'm in a minority there, since I don't share this unqualified enthusiasm for the creative imagination, which is a faculty surely capable of projecting all kinds of dark and diseased scenarios, as well as quite positive ones. I mean, serial killing, I take it, requires a good deal of imagination. But speaking of serial killing, while I'm on that topic, as I often find myself doing, I wonder if it's absolutely blasphemous to suggest, I don't know what happens in the States, but certainly in Ireland, where I live, and in Britain, where I come from originally, it always turns out, the victims of serial killers are happy, zesty, bubbly young people with hordes of friends and an enormously exciting future ahead of them. I mean, why do miserable people never get murdered? I mean, have criminologists not made a connection between these two facts? Should not people who are zesty, bubbly, with hordes of friends, shouldn't they walk warily at night? I would think, yes. Literary critics, don't they sometimes commend the imagination as a sort of kind of compensation for the paucity of real existence, as a kind of spiritual prosthesis, you might always say, by which we're able to enjoy in a vicarious kind of way the sort of experience denied to us in everyday life. I mean, if you don't have the money, for an air ticket to Indonesia or Malaysia, you can always read Joseph Conrad. For some seriously strange literary critics, this is even more real, than being in Jakarta itself. Speaking of Indonesia, by the way, I wonder why it is that, that for a long time the United States positively supported and backed a vile dictator who almost certainly killed far more people than were killed by Saddam Hussein. Yes, rather than, say, invading him in the name of freedom and democracy. Maybe he wasn't sitting on enough oil at the time. I wonder if that's the reason. What sort of society is it, you might say, where what the possible is always superior to the actual? What comment does that make on actuality? Every lethal invention on record, of course, came about through the envisaging of unrealized possibilities, through the imagination. If William Blake ranks among the visionaries, so does Pol Pot. And it seems to me no accident that this particular theory of imagination emerges pretty well, is twinned at birth, emerges at the same time as industrial capitalism, where the lives of many millions of men and women did indeed seem to require a little spiritual supplementing. The origins, the historical origins of this concept, in other words, I think are a lot more disreputable than those who unequivocally celebrate it might realize. In fact, the origins, of course, go back further. In English 18th century society, the imagination emerges as a way of compensating for what's felt to be the natural selfishness or individualism of human beings. I mean, if you have a sort of rather disreputable epistemology whereby all I can really know of you is you being a sort of fat patch on my eyeball, then how can I ever come to know you? Aren't we forever cut off from each other by the solid walls of our bodies? If this is the case, then it would seem there would be a need for some sort of rather quirky, special, intuitive, elusive faculty, perhaps akin to aesthetic taste, which will allow me to transport myself beyond my body, beyond my senses, project myself empathetically into you, into the interiority of you, which is the real you, and know what you're feeling. This theory of imagination, which is really, I suppose, born of a flawed epistemology, is alive and well as late as George Eliot in England, though not, I think, as late as Thomas Hardy. It's a faculty which makes up for our natural indifference to one another. You have to smuggle it in some really rather unarguable way, because the consequences socially and personally otherwise would be rather dire. It's a strange idea of the body, isn't it, which is that it's essentially a prison house that cuts the self off from other selves, who are equally immured within their flesh, like lifers in a cell. Phenomenologically speaking, the body, of course, is a way of being present to other people, is a way of being in the world, of being among things, so that to inhabit a body, if that's the right term, is already, as it were, to be open to an outside. Just as it were, to inhabit a language is inherently and intrinsically to be open towards an outside, or rather that both body and language, understood properly, dismantle that rather dubious distinction between inside and outside. I wonder what a sadist, for example, would make of the idea that knowing what you're feeling will move me to change my behavior. On the contrary, the sadist might just take it as a cue to carry on. Brutality, on this view, is a breakdown of the imagination, of the sympathetic imagination. But knowing what you're feeling, of course, won't necessarily inspire me to treat you any differently. I may, in fact, need to know how you're feeling in order to exploit you more effectively. The Nazis knew perfectly well what their victims were feeling. It's just that they didn't care. I could rescue you from, say, being chewed by a shark without the slightest idea of what being chewed by a shark feels like. Morality has very little to do with feeling and experience, a romantic error par excellence. As Ludwig Wittgenstein once remarked, love is not a feeling. Love is not a feeling. Anyway, the imagination is thought, isn't it, to be among the most noble and edifying and prophetic of faculties, but it's also unnervingly close to fantasy, which is among the most infantile and lowly of them. I mean, poets are just, you know, those big babies who've never really ceased to relish the joys of babbling, you know, to rolling words on their tongue. So it may be, given the problems with the theory of imagination, it may be perhaps that criticism is in need of some rather more robust rationale than this. Although we could always ask, of course, why it should need a rationale in the first place. You know, why reading poems and novels should need any more justification than, you know, eating chocolate or sunbathing. Isn't the whole point of the arts, on this theory, that they're gloriously pointless? Yes, and that this is their deepest rationale in a social order for which nothing that lacks utility or an instant exchange value can really be said to exist properly at all. If that's so, then the arts, on this romantic and post-romantic theory of them, join a very rare class of things which exist autotelically, that's to say, which exist entirely for themselves, which have their ground, end, origin, raison d'être entirely in themselves. The first of those things, of course, is God, whose existence depends entirely on himself. Then there's art, which is, among other things, a displaced kind of theology from the mid-18th century or late 18th century onwards. Almost every aesthetic term is a displaced theological one. There's evil, which, as I argue in this remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book of mine, as published, is best understood as being autotelic, as being, as it were, done just for the hell of it, to use a technical theological term, and which in that sense again has an unnerving resemblance to good, because of course God also created the universe just for the hell of it, just for the delight and love of it, for no particular purpose. That is to say that he's traditionally seen as an artist and not as some kind of Victorian manufacturer. Maybe art is part of that strange and peculiar and rare and privileged class of phenomena, as it seems to keep conjuring itself up effortlessly from its own unfathomable being, with no apparent end or purpose or goal in mind other than its own self-delight, and that then gives the cue for yet another and final member of this class, namely men and women, human beings, or rather, human beings as they might be in transformed political conditions. In different political conditions, they too might be released from the dreariness and drudgery of exchange value and a purely instrumental rationality and utility, no longer have to justify their powers and capacities at the tribunal of some grim-faced judgment or history or Geist or production, and instead simply live in their capacities for its own sake. That, of course, is absolutely the ethics, the political ethics of Karl Marx. I thought you'd expect me to mention him at least once, so there it is. But also, of course, of Thomas Aquinas, conception of virtue, and Aristotle, by whom, of course, Marx was very influenced. To live for the hell of it, to turn yourself into a work of art, as Oscar Wilde might have said, is in this conception indivisibly aesthetic and moral, let's say. Well, returning, if I ever started, to the question of the criticism, what are its functions? Two classical functions for criticism are surely fairly obvious. The first is that whatever else literary critics get up to, they inquire into the workings of language. And since language is the prime medium in which we come into our own as human subjects, though it's arguable we'll never be entirely at home there, one might do worse than claim that critics are those who attend to the texture and intricacy of that which in large part makes us what we are. And that's not a task to be sniffed at. The other classical function of literature or criticism, however, is far more general than that, and one of the problems is it's not easy to put it together with that first function, and that, I suppose, is to provide a humane critique, whatever you want to call it, of the culture as a whole. And here, as I'll be arguing later, the role of the critic begins to shift imperceptibly into the task of the intellectual, so-called. Now, the oldest form of criticism on record has absolutely no problem in bringing these two apparently discrete faculties together. It was known to classical antiquity as rhetoric, and the very word rhetoric, of course, still means both the disciplined study of tropes and figures and the art or science of publicly effective and persuasive speech, institutional speech, if you like. So criticism from the outset, you might argue, was textual and political together. It was at once a matter of grasping language as a play of metaphor, and it was a practical, institutional, in the broad sense, political affair. If you wanted to win your lawsuit or argue a political case, then professional rhetoricians were on hand to instruct you in the most effective way of doing it. Rhetoric then, I suppose in our terms today, was a kind of meta-discourse, or discourse theory, with an ethical dimension, of course, to it as well. For Cicero, if not for the sophists, speaking well and acting well are hard to divide, closely allied. Now, this whole conception of criticism, in which each function, as it were, worked into the other, was gradually undermined by a whole set of historical factors, and here follows a one-sentence history of modernity. The growth of printing, the decline of the public sphere, the privatization of poetry, the rationalist or empiricist suspicion of figurative language. I think there was a member of Parliament in Westminster in the 17th century who tried to ban metaphor by act of Parliament. The bureaucratization of politics, the automatization of the literary text, and so on. Right. With the growth of what we might broadly call middle-class society, truth becomes redefined as non-dialogical, non-poetic, non-contextual, non-affective. With the rise of the middle classes. You've noticed that if you open a history textbook at any point whatsoever, doesn't matter about the period, it will always say three things. It was a period of rapid change. It was effectively a transitional epoch, and the middle classes went on rising. That's what God put the middle classes on earth to do, you know, like the sun or bread, you know, just to keep them right. But then at a certain point they do come down again. In our own epoch, of course, rhetoric has come to mean specious, bombastic, manipulative speech, the property of both autocrats and advertisers. And I understand that over here it means putting semicolons into freshmen's papers, which is a bit of a come down from Cicero, but there we are. Incidentally, I think that somebody should write an essay on the strange death of the colon, shouldn't they? Not death by colon. I'm sure there are quite a few essays on that in medical journals. But the strange, whatever happened to the colon? You know, there could be campaigns of, you know, people waving placards, you know, about let the colon live and so on, resurrect the colon. Yet, despite that not very encouraging history, as far as the, you know, the history of criticism goes, I think it's fair, isn't it, to claim that every major moment in the history of criticism, from the Enlightenment to Romanticism to, you know, the so-called early 20th century Cambridge School, indeed to contemporary literary theory, has tried to reinvent in its own fashion this elusive spot at which, you know, whatever you want to call it, language and power, sensibility and society intersect. Or so that what one might call the paradigmatic act of criticism for this modern history displays a kind of dual responsiveness. On the one hand, to the grain and texture of language, and simultaneously to the historical forces which go into its constitution. Surely something like that double optic is the hallmark of the towering critics of the 20th century, from Bakhtin and Auerbach and Benjamin and Empson and Sontag and Kristeva and Trilling and Edward Said onwards. For F.R. Leavis, that astonishingly path-breaking and courageous Cambridge critic who's become a whipping boy for a literary left that knows exceedingly little about him, the sensuous enactment of experience in poetic language is a living scandal to an industrial capitalist order governed by abstraction and utility. Poetic language is, though perhaps Leavis wouldn't quite put it in these terms, is political in itself. For I.A. Richards, his Cambridge colleague, the delicate equipoise of impulses in a poem offers a corrective to an urban environment in which those impulses are no longer harmoniously integrated. Something similar, perhaps, might be said of the American new criticism. And whatever one thinks about the politics of that, I think there's no doubt here at the acme of criticism in the early and mid-20th century, there's no doubt that criticism is regarded as an implicit political critique, and that is not defined as separate from its responsibility to the so-called words on the page. At this point, the words on the page are by no means an alternative to historical or political analysis, as they will shortly become. Now, it might be possible to carry on this story by claiming that after this historical point, criticism loses this dual function by going abstract, and that is the moment of theory. Well, maybe, but the notion that literary theory can't cope with the sensuous particularity of a text is, in my view, as much a cliche, as much as a cliche, as the very commonplace assumption, at least where I come from, I don't know about over here, that you can always identify a terrorist because, first of all, he looks just like you and me. He always has a polite word for his neighbors, but he keeps himself to himself. Yes. Astonishingly, terrorists are not mad-eyed, shaggy, hairy, schizoid creatures, you know, who go around with Kalashnikovs on their back. They look exactly like you and me. You know, mysterious. Anyway, I won't bore you with a list of literary theorists who are marvellously close readers, since it would have to include almost every well-known figure, from Kristeva and Jameson and Hillis Miller to Barthes, Adorno, Cixous, Derrida. There you are. I've given you the list. I said I wouldn't do it. Indeed, my case would be that the moment of theory, which, as I argue in my astonishingly cheap book, After Theory, is now pretty well behind us and coincided with the brief moment of the ascendancy of the political left in the 20th century from, say, roughly 1965 to 1985, that moment was the last major attempt to reinvent or re-envisage the classical conception or conjuncture between language and power. It was thoroughly in line, in my clearly partisan view, with that honourable lineage from ancient rhetoric. It is, in other words, so-called theory, which is thoroughly traditional, just as all authentic radical politics is traditional. We Marxists have always lived in tradition, as Trotsky said. It's theory which is fully traditional, with its slogan, you know, forward to antiquity, and it's the various textualisms and formalisms which are, you know, the blow-ins and the carpetbaggers and the Johnny-come-latelys and the upstarts. Now, if this high theoretical project, however, is now rapidly receding into history, I think it is for reasons relevant to what I've been saying of the functions of criticism. For one thing, the art of minutely dissecting discourse is now almost as dead on its feet as clog dancing. That would have got a laugh in Britain, but don't worry. I'm very thick-skinned, and you know they pay my travel expenses, and it doesn't matter. And I would suggest that that has precious little to do with the advent of theory, and a lot to do with a late capitalist culture for which experience itself has now become heritage, commodity, instant consumption, speciously transparent truth. You know, experience in that fetishized capital E. I live in Ireland, quite close to the Giant's Causeway, and occasionally have to run people out there. And I just feel very sad for all those millions of tourists who've been to the Giant's Causeway but didn't have the Giant's Causeway experience, you see, which you can now have, you know, with a very large E, you know. It's all laid on for you. Walter Benjamin, I think, understood that among the more tangible deprivations of modernity, it was this capacity of the system to impoverish experience itself, you know, plundering men and women of their very subjectivity, scooping them out like so many plums, which might in the end prove most grievous. What we have to fear is not really, I think, the death of history, which has of course been prematurely announced several times. Hegel believed with his customary modesty that history had now culminated inside his own head, but with a characteristic irony, that attempt to shut history down simply resulted in opening it up again, as, you know, Kierkegaard and Marx and Nietzsche and many other people responded to that, thus perpetuating the very history that they thought had been, that Hegel thought had been closed. Similar thing, surely, isn't there with the end of history, so-called, Fukuyama and all that. Marvelous irony there that the announcement that history with a large H has come to an end, which I suppose says, among other things, that the Western capitalist narrative is now so global and pervasive that, like any narrative which stretches from wall to wall, it can't recognize the presence of any other narrative, because narratives to be narratives, like for people to be people, have to be able to bounce off some other narrative. So if you globalize it, then it's very hard not to think, you know, that no other narrative will be possible. But that intellectual announcement, if one can grace it with that term, reflected a political triumphalism, especially on the part of the United States after the Cold War, which created then a backlash in the form of unleashing a new grand narrative. Because if radical Islam isn't a grand narrative, it's hard to know what is. In other words, the very act of trying to close down, or arrogantly and hubristically announcing that history had been closed down, actually managed to spark off another again, not least in the wake of 9/11. I mean, of course, the second 9/11, not the first 9/11, not 9/11 to the day before the World Trade Center, not 9/11 1971, when the United States violently overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende of Chile and installed in its place an odious dictator who went on to kill far more people than ever were killed in the World Trade Center. It's not so much the death of history then, it's rather, I suppose, for people like Benjamin and others, the threatened death of experience, which then speaks urgently to the matter of art. A demise which for Benjamin, I suppose, will be achieved largely by eradicating the very medium of experience itself, namely memory. And this in turn would, of course, involve eradicating a great deal of the future, because those who eradicate or attempt to ignore or simply turn their backs on the past are turning their backs on vital possible resources for the future. As Benjamin remarks in his Judaic way, it's not dreams of liberated grandchildren that stir men and women to revolt, it's memories of enslaved ancestors. Only by turning to the past can you recoup the energies that might propel you into the future. If I may go back to the point about the first function of criticism, the analysis of discourse then, in my experience, students today, literary students today are pretty good at spotting, say, an ethnic or a gender stereotype, but they can't, for the most part, say things like, the poem's exuberant tone is curiously at odds with its shambling syntax. They just think that was funny, which you do too. It is actually, isn't it? There is something funny about that. You know, they would just greet that sort of thing with a sort of sheepish silence one reserves for people who ask if you've been washed in the blood of the Lamb. And yet, you know, not to be able to say things like that, is a grievous disability, isn't it, for a literary critic? It's like an engineer who can't add up, you know, who's got no idea of arithmetic. Most students today, most literary students today, would be nonplussed by the critic who said of a passage in T.S. Eliot, there's something very sad about the punctuation. Tone, mood, address, pitch, pace, syntax, texture, timbre, the like. I mean, if students today are mostly ignorant of these things, staring right the way through them to look at the content, which may be interesting but certainly isn't literary criticism, if they do that, then I suppose it's partly not because they're untalented or unintelligent by any means, but because quite a lot of their teachers do that as well. Something happened in that critical history. And I don't think it was the advent of theory, which certainly as far as textual particularity goes is often in its best exponents very tenacious. Somebody might say about Derrida, mightn't they, that he's too close to the text. You know, that there's a certain myopia. I don't necessarily say this myself, but the question of how far you have to stand in relation to the text isn't itself an interesting critical question. So language not just as a structure of meaning, but as force, experience, practice, performance, you know, sensuous enactment, the home of being, all of that has, I think, been surrendered very largely to those who are virulently hostile to the other traditional function of criticism, namely its broadly political one. Yet I think that if criticism is in crisis, it's partly because that too is in crisis, not just the, as it were, verbal and analytic function, but this as well. And to understand why this is so, we have to glance briefly at the concept of the intellectual. Intellectual does not, of course, mean frightfully clever. if it did, there would be no dim-witted intellectuals, and that is far from being the case. You know, there are dim intellectuals just as there are bright truck drivers. The term is more of a job description than a personal commendation. Yet, I don't think either, at least not for me, that it just means those who professionally trade in ideas. A little too charitable an inclusion, I think, because that would actually let in academics. And in my view, with the greatest respect to everybody here, academics are almost the reverse of intellectuals. For example, academics tend, of course, to restrict their scholarly labours. This is not a criticism, this is just what they do, to a fairly narrow patch, single specialism. When I was a student at Cambridge a long time ago, one of my hobbies was sort of reading my way through the enormous book that contained the titles of all the theses PhD theses being studied in all the faculties, just to find the most, surreally pedantic of them. And the one that won by a mile was some aspects of the vaginal system of the flea. Like that, some aspects, don't you? Nothing too overreaching, very kind of very English modesty about it, nothing brash, leave something to posterity. Well, that's just the kind of thing academics do, isn't it? Not necessarily that they examine the flea. I mean, we need a pretty good eyesight for that kind of thing. But intellectuals, of course, tend to move more promiscuously, don't they, from one patch or discourse or discipline to another, so that if academics risk pedantry, intellectuals risk amateurism. Intellectuals cross disciplines, not to show how versatile they are, but because they're concerned with the bearing of ideas on society as a whole, and that requires them to be, as it were, conversant in more than one kind of intellectual discipline, as academics may be, but don't, I think, professionally have to be. Now, historically speaking, I think this social function of being a public intellectual has actually shifted around from one academic patch to another. In classical antiquity, as I've argued, it was among other things the job of the rhetorician, but also perhaps of the philosopher. In the medieval period, it becomes effectively the monopoly of the theologian. In the Age of Enlightenment, not least in continental Europe, it's the philosophe, it's the philosopher who stands at the crossroads of various kinds of conceptual traffic. Throughout the 19th century, as the natural sciences become increasingly definitive of knowledge as such, it's science, it's the natural sciences, the chemist or the physicist, or the biologist who shifts nearer to the fulcrum of public debate, public consciousness. But since science is thought to have a problem in handling value, that role of public intellectual must be carved up, must be shared with the so-called sage or man of letters or moralist, somebody who mediates between literature, ethics, philosophy, in order to keep a humane discourse alive in the teeth of a certain kind of scientific positivism. And I suppose it's not really, is it, until the early 20th century, the age of Lewis and Empson and Edmund Wilson, the early or middle of the century, that the critic's turn to occupy this public slot actually comes up. And there are a number of reasons for that, I think, which I can only briefly skim here, some of them rather disreputable reasons. For one thing, the idea of culture begins from 1900 onwards to move, of course, to become much more of a salient, of a dominant notion. That, I think, is effectively for three reasons. One is fairly obvious, the emergence of the so-called culture industry around that time, that is to say, the point at which culture finally becomes almost entirely integrated into general commodity production, of which postmodernism, so-called, will be the acme, the consummation. Second, and deeply important reason, the attempt of a certain notion of culture to stand in for what in Europe at least, not in the godly United States, but in Europe, was an increasingly failing religion. Culture is in all kinds of ways, as a concept, equipped to do that, but part of its crisis-like nature is that it failed effectively. No human symbolic system has ever been able to hold a candle to religion. The most potent historical symbolic system of all, which can, make an immediate connection between, as it were, the daily, quotidian practices of millions upon millions of people with the most imposing, transcendent truths. Culture tried and failed to do that during the 19th and perhaps first half of the 20th century. F.R. Leavis perhaps marks a certain endpoint there. And the third reason, I suppose, for the increasing salience of culture as the 20th century ran its course was the fact that if you looked at the three most powerful political forms, I mean radical political forms, first of all, by far, the most astonishingly successful revolutionary movement of modernity itself, not just of the 20th century, revolutionary nationalism, which detached one society after another in the mid-20th century from the various traditional empires. If you look at the women's movement, if you look at various forms of ethnic politics, what is surely shared by them all is the fact that culture is now the very language in which political demands are shaped and articulated. I mean culture in the broad sense of history, tradition, symbol, idiom, community, and so on. I don't mean, and so much so, of course, that we get to a point quite rapidly where culture can be defined as that for which people are prepared to die. That for which people will kill, absolutely no doubt about it, and that for which they will die. I don't mean, they're prepared to kill and die for, Schoenberg and Thomas Mann. There may be a few, seriously weird people hanging around in caves somewhere who have that view. But culture has takes on that much importance. And that means that culture has shifted over in the mid-20th century onwards from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. In a certain liberal humanist conception of it, culture cut through to the common ground where we could all meet, irrespective of our relatively trivial social differences. That was a deeply effective ideology of the traditional bourgeoisie, and don't forget that what distinguishes a Marxist is his or her undying admiration for the revolutionary heritage of the middle class, the greatest revolutionary force in history, as Marx acknowledged. At the same time as that notion of culture was also too abstract. You needed it to be tangibly crystallized or distilled. You needed something you could hold in your hand and say, this fundamentally is what we live by, and the name of that was literature or art. Yes, that gave a sensuous and concrete embodiment to those values, not least so that if you were, part of the British Raj, whatever it was, you could take that overseas and show the natives, so-called, what you finally lived by. A highly conveniently portable version of one's civilization. So I think that for those particular reasons, the literary intellectual gains an unwonted and in some ways rather alarming prominence from that period onwards. And because literary studies are of, one might say politely, of such a low profile, which is to say less politely because it's very hard to say what the hell they are about, what any discourse that ranges from death to dactyls or, what that's about. Because of that, it was peculiarly hospitable to taking on this role. Moreover, there was a negative reason for that, namely that the surrounding disciplines were less and less capable of doing so, that if you were confronted with an empiricist philosophy and a positive positivist sociology, a utilitarian ethics, a discredited theology, and so on, then the buck had to be passed somewhere, and it was passed to people who have been trained, you know, in how to spot a shift in tone in a poem, you know, and who now suddenly began holding forth on the unconscious, the construction of gender, the Asiatic mode of production, and so on. Now, I suppose in a certain sense that amateurism didn't matter so much as long as critics were fairly harmless kinds of people, you know. You could tolerate a spot of imprecision as you wouldn't in, say, you know, brain surgery or, you know, aeronautical engineering, for example. But at the moment critics began claiming a certain rather portentous public role for themselves, certain problems began to follow. So to conclude, my point there simply is that cultural theorists are perhaps the latest form of traditional public intellectual, a bit of a worrying fact for old-fashioned materialists like myself, for whom culture has a sort of inherent tendency as a concept to get out of hand. It's very hard, isn't it, to get culture as a concept into focus. It's almost, one almost always ends up either overrating it or undervaluing it. And to that extent, it's rather like sexuality. And that's the only bit of this lecture you'll remember in 2 weeks' time. There's now, of course, a rampant hyperbolization of the concept of culture known as culturalism, postmodern culturalism, for which culture goes all the way down. Culture is wall to wall. There is nothing that is not cultural, which to my mind simply empties the concept of any usable meaning the more it's stretched beyond endurance. I wouldn't want to argue that culture is where it's at. Indeed, it strikes me that standing as we do on the edge of on the brink of a new millennium, the problems that actually confront humanity are rather boringly, but also rather alarmingly, much the same old material problems that confronted it on the brink of the first millennium. Poverty, disease, war, famine. We've thrown in a few fashionable new ones, like, you know, nuclear weapons, just to make our mark, you know, on history. They're not, in any specific sense, it seems to me, cultural problems at all. Well, they're cultural in the boring, expanded sense of the category, which includes everything. But they don't have any, not a cultural cutting edge to them. It seems to me that it's not true that our nature is culture, as the culturalists would want to maintain. It does seem to me that that culture is of our nature, in the sense that we're all born prematurely, that we're all born helpless, we're all born with a huge hole in our nature, and unless culture in the extended sense of care and kinship moves in on us straight away, then we will most surely die. Culture has that kind of importance, but that's another story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I imagine there are many questions, comments, thoughts to follow this up. And if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, I'd like to request that you raise your hand, wait to be recognized, and then most important, wait for one of the microphones to reach you so that everyone in the room can hear your question or comment. We'll wait just a minute for people who have to exit. Terry, do you want to recognize the questions, or do you want me to call on people?
I could do that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So just make them wait for the microphone.
The microphone, yeah. Okay. Okay.
As a Marxist, does Islamic terrorism lend itself to Marxist analysis? or not, because religion is the opiate of the masses and you just write it off?
Oh, I think there's a great deal of serious attention by Marxists and other left political thinkers of late to Islamic fundamentalism. In any case, Marx wasn't just dismissive of religion. You see, the passage about the opium of the people, though you might argue that fundamentalism is the crack of the people, you know, as they always say, when put in context, says religion is the heart of a heartless world, it is the soul of soulless conditions, it is the opium of the people. Marx thought that religion was the best sort of heart that a heartless society could manage. You know. I think it's also, but I take the point of what you're saying in the sense that it challenges a certain kind of reductionist Marxism, doesn't it? Because of course, if ideology or culture is what people are prepared to kill for, if it's as central to their social and personal lives as that, then it's certainly not just some ideological reflex, you know, that can be dismissed in that way. I mean, I suppose that Marxism, let's not forget when we're talking about fundamentalism, we're talking about, you know, Texans as well as Talibans and other Americans and other people in Western Europe. You know, fundamentalism is by no means confined to Islam. But that when we're talking about that, we're talking, aren't we, essentially about, I suppose, about anxiety, that fundamentalism is the reflex, whatever form it takes, of an extremely deep-seated anxiety of people who feel, you know, they've been sold out or washed up or left behind or trampled over, and from that anxiety comes hatred. You know, but as I think it's true perhaps that the opposite of love is not really hate, as Leopold Bloom mistakenly says in Ulysses, but is fear. And the other side of fundamentalism, the flip side of it, the flip side of all that ugly concentration on literal meaning and roots and our patch and our identity, is those who have no belief, no identity, who fly the skies, yes? That the world becomes divided between those who believe too much and those who believe too little. You know, the I mean, capitalism, late capitalism, in my view, doesn't really demand much belief. It doesn't work by belief. As long as you roll out of bed and pay your taxes and don't shoot too many policemen and all that kind of thing, you know, the state doesn't mind what you believe. You believe what the hell you like, yes? As long as you're not a threat to it in some way. So that, I mean, as often, America, United States is exceptional. It is a stridently ideological society, which wears its ideology on its sleeve, yes? Which is not where ideology works best at all. But that normally speaking, I think late capitalism is a faithless and, as it were, unbelieving form of life. It just is, naturally, secular, rational, relativistic, skeptical, and as far as belief goes, look at what people do, don't look at what they say. You know, their hand on heart, you know, God and nation and all that stuff. You know, look at what they do in the marketplace. That will embody their real beliefs. But that in turn, that faithlessness which rides roughshod over other people's belief systems sparks then, if you like, a fundamentalist backlash, and the world becomes caught between the two camps, in a sense. Yes? Yeah.
I'd just like to ask you to comment briefly on just your perspective on the defamiliarization, the aesthetic concept of defamiliarization that was so central to early 20th century Russian formalist theory. And the reason I ask is that you said that most aesthetic terms for in our tradition are displaced theological ones, and that strikes me as strikingly not obviously the case for defamiliarization, which of course belongs to a different context.
Yes. Well, two things very quickly. If if defamiliarization is the aesthetic category par excellence, then the formalists have stumbled on the key to all mythologies. They've done what nobody else has ever been able to do, namely found a single central characteristic of all aesthetic discourses. Yes, I don't think they did, actually. I don't think that defamiliarization, however you stretch the concept and however important it undoubtedly is actually accounts for all kinds of aesthetic effects. I think it is though, in a very indirect sense theological, isn't it, in this sense, that like a lot of early 20th century devices, it reacts to what it sees as a boring, tarnished, prosaic, commonplace, everyday life. Art has to deviate from that kind of life in order to be effective. And that is a very specific and ideological view of the common life. It's not, for example, one shared by Bakhtin, you know, the colleague of the Russian formalist. And I think in turn that is life without epiphany. You know, that is life without revelation, and in a sense, life without grace. You find something similar in Hopkins. Hopkins thinks that he can get something out of language only if he twists and turns and, you know, stretches and compresses it. That sense that language in its ordinary existence is radically inauthentic, and that you have to do violence to it to get something out of it, is pervasive throughout the first decades, isn't it, of the 20th century. And I do think, well, that's got a lot to do with a society in which language itself has become very tarnished through commercial and industrial and bureaucratic practices. But I think it's also a sort of world without revelation, and the act of estrangement is a sort of parody of a moment of revelatory insight or epiphany, if you like, but now in very hard-nosed materialist terms. Yes? Ah. There's somebody over there. Yes.
When answering the first question, you mentioned fear. And how do you think that plays in the inability, possibly, of literary criticism to duplicate what theology was able to do in religion itself, to instill not necessarily fear itself, but that we live under fear?
Oh, I see. Yeah. I suppose the anxiety of influence is the nearest it's come, isn't it? Well, of course, fear is a quite often misunderstood theological term, isn't it? Particularly in some sort of radical Protestant circles. You know, really that, you know, God's an old bastard, you know, and you've got to watch it, otherwise, you know, he'll finger you. What's fearful about God, of course, is the ruthlessness of his love. The sheer uncompromising ruthlessness of his mercy and forgiveness, which in the Hebrew tradition, in the Hebrew Bible, is something that you can hardly bear. I mean, it's hell. It's the fire of hell. The fire of hell is the love of God. It burns you up. Yeah? So that the heretical image of the, you know, there's the old bastard of a God, you know, Nobo Daddy, the old patriarch, and you have to suck up to him to be saved. But then there's also the nice, cuddly sort of God, you know, the cuddly side of God, or his son, you know, is of course entirely heretical. It misses the fact that what is terrifying about God is that he is a terrorist of love. Yeah, and won't settle for half. And that sort of unconditional loving is just not anything that we can do. Yes. So I think fear has to be understood, you know, not as fear of the tyrant, but fear of something which is just not familiar to us, and so on. The image of God as the patriarch that you have to, at all costs, please and placate by obeying all the rules, I think is known in the Hebrew Bible as Satan. Satan is, of course, means in Hebrew accuser or adversary. It's not only those who see Yahweh in that way, but those who want to see him in that way, because being, as we all are, chronic masochists, you know, we want to be punished. We want to unleash the death drive onto ourselves, and that might then allow us to expiate ourselves. But what's frustrating about God is that when these Pharisees of all ages come along and do all the right things, it turns out that what he says to them is, well, I love you anyway, and you didn't really need to, you know, which sort of pulls the carpet out a bit from under them, you know. They don't want that kind of God. It's all too easy, you know. They want a bit of robust, athletic, moral, you know. Anybody? Yes, as young woman here. Yeah.
Thank you. So I wondered, where does the literary critic stand on oral literatures and performance? Is it really the realm then of cultural critics?
Apart from sometimes performing my own songs, I don't really know much about that, which I very much like to confine to keep in the oral tradition. I don't like them being written down, some sort of fetishistic thing about that. I don't know. I think that I think it ought to be part of the patch of the literary critic. You know, very much. I don't think it should be. We should have a division of labour there between the literary and the cultural, or the oral and the written, because the oral and the written so often play into each other, don't they? You know, there are different modes of the same thing in many ways. And the point about rhetoric, of course, among other things, is that criticism begins as a study of an oral type of culture, you know, which is not in the first place written at all. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Earlier I heard you mention something fictional as being less real than Madonna, which I found to be an interesting way of putting it, because, you know, at least to me in a sense, Madonna is something of a fictional, you know, fictional identity worn by a real person. I guess my question is, you know, for the cultural critic, you know, can a cultural critic apply cultural criticism to, real people in real circumstances, or at least presentations of them, as they would to fictional, people and circumstances? And, if so, how would such analyses differ?
Yeah. Oh, I think so, yes. I mean, also, actually, fictional doesn't necessarily mean not empirically true, does it? Indeed, some theorists of fiction would say actually that you could have a text that was entirely factually true but was also fictional. Fiction being, as it were, part of the way you relate yourself, part of the way you take that text, kind of question of uptake. So I think fictionality, which I'm trying to write on right now, is perhaps I certainly find the hardest branch of literary theory. Philosophers who work on fictionality, judging from the examples they give of fiction, have only ever read the Sherlock Holmes stories and the first sentence of Anna Karenina. So they're not the best equipped, in some ways. But it is very hard. But I think the question of truth and falsity and fictionality, you see, fiction doesn't need to be empirically false, does it? To say a text is fictional is to say, among other things, what we should do with it. Yes. For example, I think that there is implicit in the idea of fictionality the notion that we should somehow generalize this meaning. Yes. We shouldn't take it just as this particular story about this particular person. Yes, this is most obvious in allegory, but there's a sort of implicit generalization built in, and how that works is very hard to define, I think. But I wouldn't want to say just straight off that fact and fiction are necessarily always opposed, and I don't take that view for some fashionable postmodern reason, namely that facts are always fictions. I don't think that helps particularly. I think Mike.
One more question?
Yes, I think Mike had a question there. Yes.
If as you say, criticism is dying and you need someone with dual optic to resuscitate it, who would you propose besides yourself, Terry?
As a redeemer. I suppose that one thing that happened, actually, Mike, was that criticism went creative, didn't it? This is now rather a long time ago, but one of the many boundaries deconstructed by postmodernism or post-structuralism was between the creative writer, so-called, whatever that means, and the critic. And I do think that can be seen, among other things, perhaps among more positive things, as a rather last-ditch, desperate attempt to rescue criticism from increasing irrelevance. I would answer your question like this, Mike. I think that it's not for art, it's not for the critic, or indeed the artist, to legislate the circumstances under which he or she might again become relevant. That's a matter of politics, roughly. People like Benjamin could try to refunction, as he would say, the role of criticism, because people like Brecht existed and their dramatic practice, because that in turn was part of a mass socialist movement which had its own newspapers and theatres, and that you can't legislate into existence. Certainly not intellectuals can do that. But I mean, the great revolutionary avant-gardes of the 20th century, not just in Weimar but in Russia, understood, didn't they, that without that being keyed into that kind of movement, they were finished. It was part of their own materialist doctrine that art couldn't do it by itself. Yeah.
Well, I suggest that we thank Terry Eagleton and Tom. Thank you.